Okay, so we'll get started while waiting for other people to join. I would like to thank everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are on earth. My name is Assane Gueye. I don't have a job right now. No, joking, of course. 5 days ago, I was a faculty member with Carnegie Mellon University, and I was sitting in our campus in Kigali, Rwanda. And my background is in networking, security, and ICT for development. Uh, uh, I will be the chairing this webinar today, and if my connections does not cooperate, we have my colleague Bamba Gay, who is also on the call, will take over, but hopefully my connection will work. So today we'll be talking about reimagining satellite connectivity from the ground up. I will get back to that, but this talk will be given by my colleague and friend and close collaborators, Professor Swarun Kumar. I will let you know a little bit about Swarun. I wanted to just take some time to tell you that this networking channel is continuing, and we have a talk actually on the 11th of February. Please make sure that you register and then you join us. We'll be talking about AI, actually, networking for distributed AI. Yes, so you can also follow us on our Slack channel, and this talk will be recorded, and the recording will be shared actually with everybody on this channel and I mean beyond. So let me come back to this talk and introduce you the speaker today, Professor Swarun Kumar, who will be talking about satellite, but from the Earth. So usually when we talk about satellite, people tend to really raise their head on the yeah. So today we'll be talking about satellite from the ground side, and Swarun will be entertaining us about his work in that. But Professor Swarun Kumar is a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the ECE department, and he is also affiliated with the CS department, the HCI Institute, and Scilab, which is the Cybersecurity Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. Swarun heads the Laboratory for Emerging Wireless Technologies, YTech. He designed and built novel systems to enable faster wireless networks and services. Swarun's research led to several best papers, congratulations, bro, in conferences such as SIGCOM, UBCOM, and you name them. Okay, Swarun is a recipient of the 2024 ACM SIG Mobile Rockstar Awards. Man, I didn't know you were a rock star. And in 2021, also, he received the ACM SIGBED Early Career Researcher Award. He was awarded NSF Research Career. He got a Google, you will name them. Swarun has been really an accomplished scholar, and he has been working a lot on satellite. And today he will be talking about satellite, but from the ground up. So please join me to welcome my friend and collaborator and actually colleague, Professor Swarun Kuam. I just wanted to say, if you guys have any question, please use the chat, the Q&A, and you can ask a question at any time. Please use the Q&A. And of course, the chat, if the Q&A is not cooperating, we would appreciate a discussion. So please ask your question during the presentation. So Swarun, let me leave you the floor, and thank you again for your time and for entertaining us today. To you, Bud.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hassan, and I hope you're all able to see my slides now. Okay.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you, Hassan, for that very kind introduction. I think it's really exciting to address all of you on talking to you about my work on satellite connectivity. It's a subset of my work, but it's something very, very close to my heart. So I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to share it with all of you. So I know I said my work, but technically it's the work of the YTech Lab, which I lead, and we work on a whole range of um, things wireless, not just satellite networking systems, but also various aspects of low power, future wireless, battery free, localization, millimeter wave, and you name it. And I know I'm going to present all of this work as if I did it, but it's actually the work of all of my students, as is the case for, I guess, most faculty out there. We have an army of several students who've contributed to the projects that I'm going to talk about. I want to specifically call out a few of them whose papers I'm going to mostly lean on. Vaibhav, who is now at Apple, worked on a whole range of satellite networking. His entire thesis was on satellite networking. There's also Veronica, who's in my lab right now, who's also co-advised with Assane, by the way, as well as Akshita, who contributed to some of the work in this space, and also Akshay Gadre, who's a professor right now at the University of Washington. So some of his work, is also presented here, but many, many others. I'm sure a whole range of my students contributed to these projects as well. All right. So I also wanted to call up to some of my colleagues. So this and the NSF in particular, because most of these projects were supported by uh, our NSF CPS Frontier Center, which is called Software Defined Nanosite Constellations. I know you all know about satellite software defined networking. This is software defined satellite networking. So our pitch to the NSF back when it was supported was we want to build a constellation of very, very small satellites, and these are going to be new age cyber physical systems that are autonomous, that can collect data, do machine learning at the orbital edge, which is basically space, and then be able to collect data, network it downstream, which is the networking pieces where I come in. And this is a wonderful project with a bunch of my colleagues, Brandon Lucia, the PI, Zach Manchester, Gauri Joshi, and Vyas Shekhar as well. So it's been an exciting ride working with them and launching satellites, building ground infrastructure. So kudos to all of them as well. Okay, with all that, let's sort of dive into the into the meat and potatoes of the talk itself. And like Assane mentioned, please feel free to drop in your questions in the chat or Q&A. And I'm going to lean on Assane to relay those to me in case I miss it myself. All right. So let's sort of head into the talk. So we all know satellites are super important. They're growing. The number of satellite launches across the world it's just been expanding with projections to hundreds of launches of satellites every year already happening, and the number of satellites in space has already reached the thousands. So it's quite crazy. And I can show you more and more graphs, and there's lots of reasons for this. Launch costs have plummeted, and that has played a huge role in making all of this happen. The satellites also, interestingly, have gotten smaller, and so sometimes you hear, 40 satellites have been launched in this one mission, or 100 satellites have been launched in this one mission. You can bet that a good chunk of those are these very tiny, tiny scaled satellites. And as a result, you can launch a lot more of them and cover a lot more of the world. But if you look at the ground stations, and I think Assane already spoiled it for you a little bit from the from the talk title. We forget that satellites don't work in isolation. They require ground infrastructure. They require ground receivers to collect the useful information that they gather. And when you think about a satellite receiver, you are thinking of something typically that's quite large and a complex device of its own. And unfortunately, ground infrastructure has not kept up with the scaling and the size and the cost reductions that the satellite network infrastructure has, satellites themselves have experienced. So,
just curiosity, why is it that people I mean, we tend to forget that ground is part of this. I mean, I've seen a lot of activities on what's happening in the actually space. What was the reason?
I think part of it is just the nature of it. If you and I think this is a sort of an experience that only people who launch satellites sort of figure out. When you launch a tiny satellite, especially in satellites in low Earth orbit, they're spinning around the world all the time, like several times a day. And if you're building a ground receiver to collect data, like say we at CMU, we have our ground receivers like sort of right here on rooftops in Pittsburgh, not working super well right now given the snow that's the snow deluge has hit us. But that aside, we only see our satellites overhead for like 6 minutes or 7 minutes, right? And then it's off the horizon. That's a challenge if you want to collect all the data that you have to collect in such a short amount of time. And then we're going to have to wait another day or so for it to come back again in the exact same orbit for us to be able to collect data optimally. So for this one satellite that we've launched, if you want to get true 24/7 coverage, we need infrastructure all around the world. And that's not something we can afford to build ourselves. And so there's this, if you ask me, and we'll come back to this a little bit towards the end, there's the satellite haves and the have-nots. The haves, typically governments or specific companies, have a whole bunch of infrastructure all over the world, and they're okay. But the have-nots, like people like us, universities, or even people who are running smaller scientific missions, they don't have the resources, and they have to wait and lease, and that becomes a big part of their budget, if that makes sense.
That makes sense. Thank you. So you really see the problem once you start deploying and trying to go on scale.
Yeah, yeah, and remember that you one of the nice things about a satellite, especially small satellites, you launch it, it's floating out there. You don't. I mean, it's going to die eventually. It's in the sense the device is going to fall apart or break for radiation might impact it eventually. But you don't need to touch it after that. The ground infrastructure, you need to pay for it every month, right? Or make sure it works every so often, and that becomes a recurring cost as well. So that's the other dimension to the ground versus the space equation. Anyway, I think we'll keep.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So if you look at I mean, this is not a problem that we've just discovered, right? There's a whole range of portals where you can sort of access information on satellites as well as satellite ground infrastructure. And if you want to go to any government satellite and sort of get data on individual satellites, you'd see immediately there's a sort of a bit of a delay that you want where you want if you want access to data. So for example, let's say I'm interested in a real-time image of the Earth at a given point. I'm simply not going to get it until a certain amount of time, right? So which becomes a bit of a challenge, and also the cost is fairly high as well. So if I want to have access to commercial data from satellites as well, that becomes very expensive as a result. If for real-time access to satellite imagery data, which is one of the points of interest in this work. So our thought process is, okay, can we have this geo-distributed set of satellite ground infrastructures all around the world? So can we have ground station as a service? And it turns out we are not the first to think of that concept either. There's AWS Ground Station that's been emerging. There's a whole bunch of other services from Microsoft, others who've recognized that you need to have ground infrastructure service. At least at the time that this work was released, these were all relatively nascent but growing, right? There are also some open source efforts. SatNox is one. TinyGS is another one which tries to kind of create this a crowdsourced set of ground stations. The challenge, of course, is that these tend to be expensive, and when you use a ground station as a service, nevertheless, because I think at least at this point in time there are relatively few players who know how to do it well. And on the open source side, we still require users to deploy these ground stations, and they they record specific higher order data. And if you build tiny ground stations, they're not going to be very performant. You also have limited access to low level signal information. So what we wanted to address is this: okay, can we do something more interesting with this problem of renting ground stations, right, in the long term? And if you want to look at what our homemade, bigger ground stations look like, they kind of look like this on a rooftop with lots of cables, lots of wires. Of course, it's a grad student project, but you can imagine that it can get quite messy and complex, right? Okay, so what we wanted to do is that we wanted to another thing I wanted to show you, right, is if you look at the networks of SatNogs, TinyGS, especially some of these user distributed ground stations, you see a lot of them in Europe, you see a lot of them in the Americas, but there's not enough deployed in underdeveloped regions and remote regions that specifically require ground infrastructure as well, which is an imbalance. Particularly, remember that doesn't matter where you launch a satellite, they're going to orbit all around the world, and all populations benefit from access to data, especially satellite imagery data, which helps in a range of applications from weather prediction to coastline monitoring and the like. So it helps to ask why we need specialized ground infrastructure in particular for satellite ground stations. There's obvious reason. Satellites are really, really far away. And so the farther they are, it gets harder to, and the signal that you receive is more feeble. And of course, the low Earth orbit satellites are closer, but still far away, like 200 to 2,000 kilometers, which is still quite distant compared to, let's say, your cellular base station. That's one. But also these satellites are moving around the Earth. I mean, I already kind of spoiled this to you. The LEO satellites are orbiting the Earth 3 to 5 times a day. And so if you are in any location on the ground, you're literally seeing these satellites for at most 10 minutes, which is not a lot of time to collect data, right? And now if you look at some of these satellites as well, and you have this ground station, you need a ground station which is a very high antenna gain, so bigger ground station, so that you get a strong enough signal. And then it needs to also track these satellites as they move, so that you get have these directional antennas that point to the satellite and receive a good quality signal, right? So some of these satellites, if you're really, really interested, can cost millions of dollars, but at least for a lot of the ground communication infrastructure, they're going to at least cost several thousands of dollars and going to occupy a lot of space on a roof. So one of the things that we wanted to address in just of reducing cost is we need something that's more cost effective. And can we learn from what satellites did, which is just build smaller satellites, right? So can we build smaller base stations, and what does that look like, right? So our goal was to reduce the size, the cost of the satellite ground infrastructure, and pave the way for making scalable global ground stations a lot easier. So it becomes the barrier to entry for setting up a satellite ground station becomes low, much like what the small and chip-sized satellites did for satellite launches and reducing the barriers to a satellite launch. So can we go from something that looks like on the left, right, which is bigger than a human-sized device, to something that fits in the palm of your hand?
Swarun, I'm a little bit curious. I mean, when maybe I'm anticipating you might be talking about this later, but I mean, do you need any collaboration from the satellite owners when you were trying to do all this? Do you need to convince them to, cooperate with you, or do you just do that? How does it happen?
So in general, we would. In this specific case, we relied on the NOAA constellation. Fortunately for us, NOAA is a very old, it's a weather, it's a series of weather satellites, basically. NOAA has a very relatively known open source published information that it broadcasts. So it's just sending imaging data of the Earth. And it's always just sending data down, like taking an image of the Earth, sending it down, taking an image of the Earth, sending it down through a pretty open protocol. So it wasn't very hard for us to replicate it. But in general, if you were doing this, let's say for Starlink or somebody else, we would need to know what they're implementing, and in some cases we don't, they don't publish it. That's a good point.
I see. Would that be a barrier for this type of thing?
It would be a barrier in the sense that we need to know the signals that we are decoding. My hope is that if we build something like this, the first customer for it would be people who actually launch the satellites, and that need not be Starlink. That could be you and me, right? People in universities, researchers, scientists who are deploying satellites of their own, and they require ground infrastructure. They can use something like this, and they know the protocol that they're relying on to transmit to the ground.
I see. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple of different projects that have this spirit. First is a system called Quasar, which relies on a bunch of these distributed ground devices that are very low cost to improve performance. Later, I'm going to talk about Selfie Stick, which relies on groups of satellites working to get, being able to decode a bunch of satellites together with a single receiver. And then we're going to talk about open space just towards the end, which is, I know I promised talking mostly about the ground, but I know many of you are excited about what happens in space. So we'll talk about some of our ideas for what needs to happen for satellites, as well as some of the projects, and maybe a little bit of a hint of the projects that are already up there in space. Okay, so let's start with Quasar. So like I said, the idea is to take these big satellites and convert them into smaller, simpler satellites, and effectively get you a low form factor and a low cost satellite ground station. The size reduces, but then that means our antenna gain reduces. That means our received signal power to noise power ratio, our SNR, signal to noise ratio, takes a hit. So it's not like we can just miniaturize a satellite ground station and nothing happens. Everything is fine. Obviously it's not going to be as good as at picking up signal as a big high gain antenna is going to be. So what do we do about it, right? So here's the idea. I mean, and you kind of guessed it. You might have guessed it from the previous slide. Have many of these. These are low cost. Have many of these, and then rely on the multiplicity of the ground stations to make amends for the loss that you get in terms of signal quality. And that's the spirit of what we have in mind, right? So effectively make these cheap and low form factor, but also distributed, allowing for you to build this distributed ground station that then punches above the weight of a big satellite. So for classical computer science concept of like RAID, right? Like just have a whole, replicate cheap components to kind of mimic the performance of a big device. Right. So the idea here is, at the signal level is to think about something called coherent combining, which is, let's say you have a bunch of these receivers that are all receiving signals from any transmitter. Let's say this ground transmitter. They're going to get multiple copies of the same signal. So each receiver is going to get a different copy of that received signal scaled by a factor h. This is called the channel. And then there's this nice literature on something called maximal ratio combining or coherent combining, which is if I'm able to collate all of these signal receptions at each antenna with the right weights, with a weighted average of those receptions, I get much higher signal power than any of the individual devices. So it's a very, very simple concept. More devices hearing the same thing, better than one device hearing the same thing. And that improves your signal to noise ratio as well. And again, this is all pretty well known for ground infrastructure. So maximal ratio combining is this nice trick that you can apply to improve effective SNR. Can we bring that to satellites, basically? So the idea is this. Let's say we have the satellite overhead. We have this bunch of cheap receivers, some on the rooftops, but some could even be at homes. They're all receiving these signals. They're not receiving identical signals. They're getting signals scaled by different constants or so-called wireless channels. Now you have these channels that you receive. And then at this point, one of the things that people realize in this argument is there are slight differences in clocks. They're not synchronized receivers for all of these devices. And that becomes a bit of a problem, right? Because if you want to combine them, but there are these tiny time sync or frequency sync, or what is more appropriately called phase sync errors between these transmissions, your combining doesn't work as effectively. So we need to remove these sorts of hardware effects or offsets due to the transmitter and the receiver. So how do we do that? So we cannot, I mean, ideally do not want to cooperate or assume any cooperation with the satellites in this case because we want to deploy our infrastructure in a manner that's agnostic to the satellites to the extent possible. And we want to keep the cost low and the deployability of the system high, right? So to deal with this, we have a very, very neat and interesting trick, right? Which is, let's look at where some of these satellites, at least the NOAA satellites that we relied on, operate on. And they operate on essentially combination of the VHF and the UHF bands. These are very close to what you might call the amateur radio bands. And it turns out that there are amateur radio stations, just regular radio stations, that are prevalent in most places around the world that transmit around or close to these bands. So what we rely on is to use these amateur radio signals as sort of signals of opportunity for synchronization. So can we make these receivers listen to nearby amateur radio stations? And then, hey, if I know if all of these devices can work together to figure out when exactly they received a given amateur radio reception, they can use that to figure out any timing offsets, time shifts, or even frequency shifts between them, so that they can and they can then use that to decode their satellite signals a lot better. Right. And unlike satellites, which are fleeting, only appear and disappear every 10 minutes or so, the amateur radio stations are at least a significant subset of them in any location are much more persistent. So essentially, the idea is use these signals of opportunity and effectively use these signals of opportunity to correct for these satellite side offsets, and then at that point you remove your offsets from these ground devices using the signals of opportunity, and then your ultimate correction for maximal ratio combining looks a little bit more messy, but basically it removes all ground station side offsets. So basically we're using results from the signals of opportunity to make corrections to the signals that we get from the satellites. So that's one aspect, right? Now, another aspect to sort of keep in mind is what's called the Doppler shift, which is when a satellite moves, its frequency of transmission is perceived to be slightly different because of the shear movement. This is the so-called Doppler effect. So the same reason why trains sound different when they move, right? So high Doppler shifts appear as frequency offsets that you then need to remove. So how do we deal with this? So here's sort of a very simple idea, right? So what we can rely on are that the fact that the satellites don't move in an arbitrary way. They move along specific orbits, and these are very deterministic. These are orbital parameters that you can obtain for any given satellites. And so we can use these orbital propagation models to very accurately determine what the distance to the satellites would look like at any given point in time, and then get good estimates of the appropriate Doppler shift at any given point in time. And so we can use that information to correct for the errors. So one other aspect that is a challenge is like antenna orientation and placement. We said these antennas can be indoors, outdoors, anywhere. That can cause problems. We also need to collate signal data from all of these different base stations or ground stations at the cloud, and we need to do that in a bandwidth efficient manner. All of these are important details. I wish I could cover all of them in one talk, but I want to, in the interest of time, I'll move on, but I'm happy to address questions if you're interested in all of those details as well. But we went ahead and implemented this on these very simple RTL SDR platforms that cost a few tens of dollars. We deployed it all over Pittsburgh, different regions, and we listened to a variety of satellites that operate in these VHF bands, mostly launched by the NOAA, which I'm hoping will continue to exist, which is for weather monitoring. We, as expected, we perceived gains with that improve the signal to noise ratio as you have more ground stations. You might notice the gains are logarithmic, which is to be expected because there is a sort of a it sort of works out from maximal ratio combining. One thing to point in mind is that we on the y-axis we have a dB scale, so that is a logarithmic y-axis as well. So with 8 receivers, we get about 8 dB of average gain, which if you might come from the cellular world is quite a lot and quite substantial, can improve your data rates quite effectively.
And so in terms of distribution, space distribution of the receivers, what are we talking about? Is it in a campus level, a city level, or the
City level? I would say the furthest two were like about 20 miles apart. In terms of overall dimension. Now, Pittsburgh is not a very big city. It's a pretty small city if you come and visit that. But I would say at least like town level, right, if you will, right? The only constraint that we have is that we need to be able to hear the same signals of opportunity, which is not, so I would say the range at which these can cooperate would be of the order of a few tens of miles, right? That's what we're looking at.
I see. Thank you.
Okay. So this was Quasar. Again, it was a distributed ground station paradigm with lots of different ideas for synchronization, orientation. And then one of the things we did is we have open sourced our design, and we already have partners who've adopted it, so which is wonderful. Okay, so this is a good segue into the second piece that I want to talk about, and then I'll talk about some of our satellite work much more briefly. So this is a system called Selfie Stick. And with Selfie Stick, if you've noticed what's kind of changed, in Quasar, we had all of these distributed ground stations and one satellite. Here we have kind of the opposite. And we were curious because NOAA has so many satellites. And in fact, there are so many satellites overhead. We were interested in, can we have just one of these receivers and somehow fuse data from many, many satellites, right? That was the idea of Selfie Stick. We call it Selfie Stick because it's like literally taking a space selfie from the ground, right, with a low-cost device. Because I mean, you're not going to be able to see yourself, but you're going to be able to see like yourself, and if you're here in Pittsburgh, even the Great Lakes and so on, right? So here's the idea. So let's say we have, here's sort of the rationale for it, right? Like I said before, there's all these satellites going overhead. So we have tons and tons of these satellites, including specifically imaging satellites. Lots of satellites that are taking images of the Earth right now, right? About 900 satellites right now, or at least a few years ago when this paper was written, are observing the Earth in real time. That's a ton of satellites, right? In orbit as we speak. So the idea is, can we then, all of these satellites we know right now are sending images of the Earth downstream. Could we combine them, right? Could we stitch them together to get a nice image of the Earth and sort of an Earth selfie, if you will, right? So that's what Selfie Stick was about. It's about image reception using distributed LEO satellites. And what the question that we really wanted to ask is, how simple can that receiver be that's like sort of listening to all of these different satellites? So one of the questions we ask is, do these satellites transmit the exact same data? So let's look at all of these different satellites. Let's say they're all flying over Pittsburgh, which is where you got sort of see this this picture. And as I promised, you sort of see the Great Lakes. So not like super close, but approximately close enough, at least at this scale, to Pittsburgh. And you can see that it's not exactly the same image of the Earth. The biggest difference is orientation is different, simply because they're coming in along different orbits, and therefore the orientation with which they look at the city and the state itself is a little bit different. But you do see common features, right? You can like pick out like one of the lakes and you see them, and they're kind of oriented differently, but you still see them across all of these images. And some of the artifacts, of course, are not present in all of the images. So now then, how do we fuse all of these images from different angles and perspectives from a low-cost receiver, right? So let's sort of take a step back and think about this. Let's say we have a simple ground receiver like before, like a very low-cost receiver like before in Quasar, that's receiving all of these different signals. It's going to get all of these different angles. You might say, Okay, not a big deal to fuse them. I know how to do image transforms. I can rotate them and then combine these image receptions. But then remember what happens when we use a cheap receiver, when we use a low-cost receiver. When you use a low-cost receiver, you're not going to get these images. You're going to get something very, very grainy, right? If you attempt to decode at all, which is why we had to use things like Quasar. We had to combine across multiple receivers, right? So then where are the Great Lakes here? The Great Lakes here are hardly visible, right? So here's sort of what we do, right? We can still estimate perspective differences across all of these different satellites. Now, how could we do that, right? So suppose you have these three images and you ask me what are the perspective differences? You'd say, hey, not a hard problem. There's all this image computer vision literature on like image transforms between different images. You should be able to figure that out, right? And essentially, what you would figure out is something called a homography matrix. A homography matrix is simply like think of this as a sort of a matrix transform with rotation and stretching and appropriate scaling and rotation and translation potentially, so that these two images kind of look the same, right? And we kind of know how to do that, right? But now what happens if the images are grainy? All of this homography literature relies on some features that you're able to look at the images to figure out they're the same features across both. Now, all that goes out of the window if you have very grainy images. Now you can't just look at the images and guess what those homography transformations are, right? So we need to estimate homography in the presence of noise. And it turns out there is a way to do it, because we know these images are not arbitrary, right? They're images of the Earth, and they're the images of the Earth taken from satellites. And these satellites move at known orbits. So there's one satellite that looked at the Earth this way. There's another satellite that looked at the Earth from a different orientation. So the image perspectives are not random. They're a function of the camera properties, specifically the properties of the satellite that's hosting that camera. Depending on its location and orientation, you're going to get a different perspective and a different image on the Earth. So then how do we estimate the perspective differences? Okay, here these satellites sort of going up overhead. And now if I know its geolocation, okay, and this is like, for example, let's take a Great Lake that was captured from this location. And then there's another satellite which saw it at a different location, different orientation. Can I just fuse that all into some sort of a model and then figure out the homography matrix? It's not at all hard, right? Like once you know the orbital parameters, it tends to be a pretty geometric problem, right? You're just finding the transforms between those images based on the known location and orientation of the satellites. And like I said before, satellite orbits are known quantities. So pretty data-driven, but not completely shocking approach to estimate the homography matrix. Okay, say, good. We now at least know the transformations based on satellite orbits. How do we do this RF combination? Right? Yes.
Before you tell us how we do that, there is a question on the chat. Maybe I can let you read it.
Yes. Let me see if I can find it.
It's on the Q&A, by the way. Sorry, I say chat, but Q&A.
Okay. So where the signals you received from NOAA satellites APT, how this yeah. So they were APT. You're right. We are going to require some differences in techniques if you're using different modulations, and that's something that we need to address for sure. It's going to be different. Some of the techniques are going to be different, particularly for selfie stick. A lot of our techniques are very much APT modulation tied. Now, there are ways to do it for other modulations. We just need to make the processing layer a tad bit different to make it happen. Well, that's a great question. Okay. So yeah, this is a physical layer protocol. Your protocol is going to change with the modulation that the satellites transmit. Okay, so let's kind of keep going. So after we estimate the perspective differences, we then have to correct these perspective differences before RF combination. So how do we do that? So we hear these homography matrices. We cannot now, of course, with these with the signal data, before we get these as image data, it's hard to apply them directly. We need to apply these transformations somehow in the RF domain, because for us to add these images up together, if you add them up without correcting for the transformations, they're not going to add up correctly, right? So we need to somehow apply these homography transformations in the RF domain. And this is where we rely on modulation. I think somebody guessed, preempted my question already, my observation already, right? So it turns out that these satellites that we were using use APT modulation, which is AM modulated over FM. And that's pretty much looks like this. It's going to scale the amplitude of the signal, but it's also going to scale the frequency. Specifically, the way to think about this is that imagine it's almost like a cumulative sum as far as the frequency shifts are concerned. So pixels, you get a cumulative sum of pixels at each given point in time. This, of course, is going to vary modulation to modulation. This is what APT looks like. And the RF pixels happen to be transmitted in row major order. And again, of course, the different modulations is going to look different. So here's where we can see, right? Knowledge of this RF modulation format is necessary for you to do this homography, right? So let's just understand how this happens here. Let's say you have these two different pixels here at these two different times. Now notice that they look, I mean, even if they're pixels of the same object, they look fairly different because of the cumulative sum effect, because each pixel is a cumulative sum of previous pixels, right? So the way we kind of deal with this is you think of it as taking a derivative. If it's a cumulative sum, just take a derivative, which is sort of like the pixel at any given point in time. Apply the homography to that derivative, and then combine, right? So RF combination is sort of like they undo whatever the modulation does, and then align the signals appropriately, right, to achieve the homography transformation. So if you have these two different images, here's a sort of a very, very quick animation to show you this. I'm going to go of these one row at a time. So in the image on the left, you sort of do not see anything. You just don't collect anything. But in the image on the right, you start to see these cumulative pixels sort of get as these pixels are emitted in row major order. And then what you're going to do is you're going to rely on the fact that each pixel is a cumulative sum of the previous pixels. So once you take that, the first step that you do is you take these cumulative sums that you receive, take a derivative, and that gives you that, which is basically like sort of like a convolution, basically in this case. That gives you the individual pixels, and then once you get these individual pixels, then you apply your transformation, and that gets you this. So a two-step process, right? First, you take the derivative, then you rotate and align so that they're the same. The two images are kind of line up, right? And effectively, you're doing these RF transformations, but what they're practically doing is they're mimicking homography. They're mimicking, image transformations. So there's lots of other details, synchronization, Doppler correction. Again, I'm going to leave that, punt those questions and say, go read our paper. But we went ahead and implemented this on an RTL SDR. We also used a weather antenna as a ground truth deployed on one of the rooftops in our campus here in Pittsburgh. We listened to a whole bunch of NOAA satellites. Just going to show you a few pictures of the PSNR showing you that we're getting improvements with more satellite receptions of several dB, about a 5 dB improvement, which again, in terms of image quality, when you visually see it is quite apparent, right? Like this is what one reception would look like, and which is what 10 receptions would look like. You see the Great Lakes a lot better with more satellite receptions.
Swarun,
yes.
As you talk about more receptions, I'm thinking about something you mentioned several times, which is low cost.
Yes.
How low are we talking about?
This is a few tens of dollars in terms of cost of the devices themselves. Again, this is like a university prototype where we are just getting off-the-shelf components, putting them together. But you could imagine if this was something that was commercialized, you could do a lot better than that for sure.
In terms of energy, can we power this with a battery, or do we need to be hooked to the power grid?
It's possible. It's possible to power this with a battery. It's not a low power system, but you can power it with a battery in a similar sense of how a mobile phone could be powered with a battery. I would say that would be the similar kind of power draw. You might still have to charge it once in a while, though.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So, all right, this was Selfie Stick. Like I said, it was a distributed satellite paradigm for low cost image reception. And it gets you distributed in the sense of using multiple satellites. And it gets you this very cool approach to do RF-based image perspective estimation and combination, which I think is quite interesting. And we showed this on the NOAA satellites. Okay, so I'm going to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes or so talking about satellites, just a little bit. We had this Hotnets paper with Assane and myself as well, led by Veronica, and of course with Akshita, who's also a close collaborator. And the question that we wanted to ask is, what should satellites look like, and what should be the role of academia and satellites? This was like our broader question here. And we were really interested in not satellite imaging, but satellite internet, which I think is going to be much closer to the heart of people in this call. And we were thinking about the importance of satellite networks and connectivity for disaster areas, like how sometimes if there's a disaster, if there's an earthquake, or for certain rural regions, and of course in war zones, as we're seeing, satellite internet is extremely crucial and transformative. And the satellite internet space is just been growing broadly, right? Launch costs have been reducing, and I've already made that point that there are many players who are already doing it. But if you think about it, there's sort of a monopoly, or maybe in the future you might see a duopoly of satellite players, and that's it kind of helps to understand why is that the case. Why are there only a few different operators who have really been able to reach that scale for satellite operation around the world? And if you look, even a few years ago, the reason is kind of obvious. For even somebody like SpaceX, who was launching Starlink, they needed to reach a certain scale, like 2,000 satellites, before they were able to operate any sort of commercial service, right? 2,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. And that's a big cost, a big effort, right? So if you want to build space internet, you have to kind of be at the 2,000 satellite scale. And so it's unsurprising that the companies are able to really launch scalable satellite networking platforms. They have to be, these big behemoths taking an enormous amount of effort to make it happen, right? So, and some of them are even competing with themselves, right? It's quite interesting. So now, a natural question to ask is, we might ask, right, is should we leave the satellite internet to a few players, right? And I'm just going to leave this slide and say it's quite risky to leave the whole entirety of one segment of the internet to the whims and fancies of a few companies or a few individuals, right? So it's not just me saying it. Even the chairperson of the FCC is pleading for more competition in the satellite internet market. Right now, this is quite in contrast with how the internet has looked like over the past, from its inception, right? The internet really started out with, okay, let's all make this distributed. Let's make these autonomous systems work together in a very open governance model. That was sort of the vision, right? Going back in ARPANET, I mean, there were all sorts of layers and layers to ARPANET, but at least that was the academic pitch, right? That we all bought into. And today, regardless of all of the problems that the internet might have, it's still distributed, in the sense that we don't have a kill switch with any single entity who can shut off the entire internet that we know of, right? So can we achieve internet like satellite connectivity, or an internet like satellite model, or why not, right? So big and again, can we piggyback on the fact that these launch costs have really plummeted, making these satellites cheaper and making these rocket launch costs cheaper, right? But now you might say, why do we need so many satellites? in part because the launch costs are cheaper for low Earth orbit, but these low Earth orbit satellites also need more to cover the Earth. This is a very obvious point that people miss. With geostationary satellites, a few satellites is all you need to cover the whole entirety of the Earth. But in low Earth orbit, which is over an order of magnitude closer to the Earth, you are going to have very, very tiny footprints of the Earth. So you need many, many more of them to cover the Earth, depending on the precise orbit over the Earth and also frequent handovers. Right? So this is not something that any one university or one small company can do. But what we really wanted to ask is, can a bunch of small parties collaborate on a satellite network? Like, can we, universities all around the world, come together to build a collaborative satellite network? So the idea is the following, right? And this, can we all have our own niches, looking at around the world, and then we stitch all of our vision together. So this is open space. It's a satellite network that's prioritizing image, inter-satellite communication and routing and so on and so forth. I should caveat that open space is a hotnets paper. It's more of a roadmap on how universities sort of could collaborate to build this kind of ARPANET in space. It's still work in progress. We've deployed some tiny satellites, but we've nowhere the scale of like ARPANET. So we'd love to really have partners on board, which is part of my motivation to this, to give this talk in itself, is to invite more of you to learn about satellites, launch it, and to connect with those of you who are already doing it in your own ways, and so that we can work together.
Swarun,
yes.
You have a comment on the Q&A?
Yes.
Okay, and there is a question as well.
Yes. So it is, a lot of the satellites that I'm talking about are really small satellites. So I agree. I agree with that with that note. And obviously, I want something that can fit in the budget of funding agencies around the world. So that's good. And Starlink needs so many satellites because they don't have inter-satellite links. Yeah, so I'm going to cover this point out about how many satellites you need as well. So that's a good point, right? So what do we need in terms of satellite infrastructure requirements for global coverage? And I actually want to make the point that you don't. Yes, Starlink needed to have thousands of satellites. And it needed to have thousands of satellites for like a bunch of reasons that you talked about, but also because they're delivering. At some point, they also need to scale. They need to offer like big fat pipes to a whole range of consumers. But if you technically think about it, if you're very, very careful, if you choose our orbits right, and if we want to cover the entirety of the Earth, the number of satellites we would need, even smaller satellites that we would need to cover the Earth, is of the order of even a few tens, not even a few hundred. So around 66 satellites exactly placed in the right orbits is going to be good enough. And it's probably going to be a few hundreds if you want to muck around. If we play around with the orbits a little bit more, and if you have some orbital constraints that we have to deal with, this is not crazy. This is not something that universities, let's say 50 universities working together cannot do. This now suddenly starts to fall within the budgets of typical research projects. And so what kind of network performance can we receive? Not much in terms of bandwidth, because these are going to be smaller satellites. But I think the biggest win for the satellites that we're going to be able to launch together is going to be latency. Because once you have a global constellation of satellites, the sort of propagation latency that we are going to be able to advance is going to be extremely small. And this is something that we've visited in a bunch of papers across academia, that if you're able to have satellites that are able to talk to each other as well as talk to the ground and talk the same language, we can get to latencies that are lower than the rest of the internet, and that's going to give us a lot of advantages. That's going to allow us to enter some nice, interesting niches, not just things like finance, but also emergency communications or any other time-sensitive information that needs to be relayed around the world. So let me just end this module saying, and I know I'm running out of time, that here's a call to say the satellite internet space should be more competitive. We need to really think carefully about the incentives so that, even organically, larger and smaller providers can collaborate. And then how we can tailor regulation so that we can have different regions around the world work together to collaborate to build these sorts of networks. And so here's a call to the community: launch your own satellites. Here's a few of the kinds of ones we've launched. We've launched LoRa-enabled satellites. We've launched some of the tiny satellites that do computation, Earth imaging, and it is possible in a budget of a few tens of thousands of dollars, not including students. And if we get the right team together, this is something that we can grow 60-fold, but we're not going to need a lot more than 7 million to one institution to make that happen. So all we need to do is build satellites, but not just build satellites that are doing their own thing, but satellites that actually talk to each other and work on some common networking paradigm, which I think would be transformative for our community. Here's also a tiny plug. This is going to be my last slide. A lot of what motivates us to do this is this recent initiative that we've launched called this is it's now a couple of years old, called the Communication and Compute for All, for which my colleague Akshita and I are PIs, and Assane is an integral part of. And it is a collaboration between CMU Pittsburgh and CMU Africa. Our objective is to bridge the digital divide and try and find solutions that can sort of work across the world. It engages 16 faculty across, and a big pillar of what we're trying to do is satellite networking. So some of the inter-university and across geographical collaborations that we need to do for satellite networking, we're already starting in our own small way by leveraging the different campuses of CMU itself. So with that, thank you so much. Happy to take any few questions if we have time.
Thank you, Swarun. I will leave the question for the audience. If anyone has a question, we have 2 more minutes to go. I see a lot of, a room for collaboration across the world. I see the network of universities across the world working on launching their satellites and leveraging each other. That's quite cool. I don't see any question. Maybe, Swarun, I will give it back to you for last word, maybe call to action. I like that idea for collaboration among universities.
Yeah. This is I think for me, right, I'd like to end on this note, right? Both in the ground station world as well as in the satellite work, we can collaborate a lot more. And I don't want the collaboration overhead to be extremely high. It's not that we all need to work together and launch the identical satellites together, but maybe we can take small steps, sort of similar to what ARPANET did, which is back in the ARPANET days, individual universities still had their own variances in what they were running within. They just had pipes to talk to each other in an effective way. And that's all was needed, right? The whole of the internet was designed with this paradigm of everybody do their own thing in local islands. We just inter-network these networks. Can we apply the same principles to satellites, which is, can we at least agree on a few baseline parameters for what inter-satellite links need to be, what ground stations need to look like, what frequencies we operate? If we can agree on a few of those common parameters, if we can standardize them for our community, the satellite launches that we're doing anyway for our own projects are not going to be like islands that are disconnected, but they're going to be this one common fabric that can do where the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And the same can hold for ground infrastructure as well.
Thank you. That's a very powerful way to end this discussion.